Okay, let's try this again. All right, week 32, book 32, Post-Truth by Lee McIntyre. We're just gonna straight on into this. Um, we all know that we live in a world in which, facts have become disputed, and not just difficult facts to prove, what seems to be very obvious facts. Like, for instance, whether or not Trump's first inauguration crowd was the largest ever. Okay. Now, we have photographs, we have videos, we have counts by established people who do this kind of thing, the people who've attended these other things. And we can see clearly from these pictures and from this evidence that Trump did not have larger crowds than, say, MLK, which he claimed, or from Obama's inaugurations, which he claimed. We know this is not true. Now, why would it even matter? Well, because his followers and him adamantly insist that he did have larger crowds. Now, how does this happen in the face of evidence? And this is what McIntyre is getting at. Now, this book is published in 2017, and so, even in the 5 years since then, 5 years in the, what, 8 years, 8 years since then, we have come a remarkable distance from even what he's talking about. uh, the pace of what he calls post-truth, or later on he calls possibly pre-truth, and it's really the pre-truth concept that is more interesting to me than the post-truth. Now, what he's talking about with post-truth is this creation of alternative facts that Kellyanne Conway talked about, which Trump is doing with the inauguration, that sort of thing. It's like, well, you have your facts and we have our facts. Now, as is obvious by my discussion here already, and as McIntyre makes perfectly clear early on, it's not possible to talk about this without yourself becoming politically charged in one direction or another. Um, I'm clearly on the left here, as is McIntyre. I believe that Trump is a liar, and barely knows how to even tell the truth, as does McIntyre, as does the majority of what might be called evidence out there in the world. Now, when I say the majority of the evidence out there in the world, it's important to understand that those people who believe that Trump is not lying, they have their own set of what they think of as evidence. Now, some of this is what might be called um, negative evidence. And what I mean by that is they don't have any evidence that the New York Times, for instance, has lied about this particular story or that particular story. But they do have evidence that the New York Times has lied about a story at some point in its history. And because it has lied about a story in its history, they use this as justification to say the New York Times lies. Now, New York Times has also potentially skewed evidence or interpreted things in a specifically an anti-Trump way. Again, they use this as evidence that this other story, which you seem to have great evidence for, yeah, we can't trust the source here. And of course, this kind of deceptive attack, is rampant on the right. Um, you know, uh, So what's going on here is that the very concept of a journalistic standard is being attacked. And now, it's important to recognize, as McIntyre talks about, that the very idea of a journalistic standard is not necessarily that old of a concept. We tend to think, oh, well, at least some people tend to think that, oh, well, the press used to be objective, and in the past 10, 5, 15, whatever years, it's become increasingly partisan one way or another. That's not entirely true. The reality is that all authors are always biased, and the press and those who cover the news have always been biased. And we can go back to the stories of the emperors of Rome. And you've heard about the horrible things that Nero did, and you've heard about the horrible things that Caligula did. How much of that is true? You ever thought to ask? maybe the people who wrote these things had an axe to grind. Maybe they made up some stories. They exaggerated some things. Did Caligula actually attack the ocean and think he was accomplishing something when he was going to supposedly invade Britain? I don't know. And neither really does anybody else. It all comes down to whether or not we trust the source and, what we make of that source. Why would the source have a reason to tell the story the way that they do? Does the source demonstrate a desire to be accurate, even if that accuracy isn't necessarily working in their favor? These are the kinds of things that you might ask, is it established source, etc. So part of this is source based, right? But then again, you take something like the New York Times, supposedly the quote, paper of record. How did it become that? Well, around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900 or so, uh, yellow journalism basically caused the Spanish-American War. And what is yellow journalism? This was a deliberate distortion of facts on the ground because a war was sensational and a war would sell papers. And so Hearst basically manufactured a war by his reportage and making up of facts. And we got into a war, and Hearst sold papers. After this happened, certain journalists decided that having some kind of standard for truth would be a good idea. Now, McIntyre goes into details, and I don't remember the exact details, but essentially the uh, what was going on was you had papers that would report facts from one direction, papers reporting facts in another direction. And the New York Times decided to focus on information-based stories. So they would actually lay out the full information of the story, not just give you headlines and not just give you buzzwords. And that's where they became the journalistic standard. Um, but the point here is that the idea that the news is biased has been with us from as far back as we know. This is nothing new. What is new is this reportage of alternative facts, this reportage of things that are widely known to be untrue as truth within certain communities. And this sort of echo chamber, this information silo, as he calls it, that we live in these days, information silos, where if you're on the left, all you get is left wing news. If you're on the right, all you get is right wing news. You know, and of course, I look at something like, say, I don't know, what's going on X these days, used to be Twitter, or what's going on Fox News and that kind of thing. And I see this as horribly biased. Whereas, what do I make of my own news sources? What do I use? How accurate and how free of bias are my sources? Well, they're not. And and this becomes a problem when you start attacking one source from another source, one bias from another bias. What's going on there? Now, McIntyre, what he's really getting at here, though, is what I think towards the end of the book, what he gets into, which is pre-truth, which is the construction of reality because one has power. And that is kind of where I think Trump and his group is. So you see things like, them saying Haitians are eating the dogs and the cats, as he famously said on the campaign trail. And this was an outright lie. This is just an outrageous slur, a stereotype, a updating of anti-Semitic rhetoric to include some other unwanted immigrant, and in this case, Haitians, from the Trumpian point of view. Has no basis in reality, in fact, whatsoever. But that becomes irrelevant because it becomes believed by the group and it constructs reality for them. Perhaps the most notorious claim in this regards, although that's one of them, perhaps one of the most notorious claim is that Trump won the 2020 election. Now, you would think, okay, if he won the 2020 election, there would be some kind of evidence of massive fraud. You could not produce enough fraud for one side to win an election. without you know, that they didn't deserve to win without producing evidence. Okay, so where's the evidence? They have been unable to produce a single piece of evidence that they can introduce in court. Not one. Over 50 court cases, and they produced exactly zero evidence. Doesn't matter. He still says it, and his followers still believe it. In fact, Oklahoma has even made it part of their curriculum to teach that the election was stolen by Biden. Now, this is not true. As a matter of fact, almost every example of real world voter fraud that we know of from the 2020 election was the Republicans. And Fox News and the My Pillow guy and other people have been sued by the by Dominion, one of the companies that provided the voting machines, and they've won those lawsuits. Dominion has won those lawsuits against Fox News and the My Pillow guy, demonstrating that they knowingly spread lies. They knew these things weren't true. The same thing is true of some of the lawyers and some of the people who went to bat for Trump. Um, Trump himself would have probably been convicted of tampering with the election if he hadn't won the election and was able to squash that prosecution altogether. Um, but those people who support Trump are going to disagree with every single word I just said, despite the fact that every single thing that I said is based in established reality. It is there in the court cases. It is there in the proceedings. But they're still going to disagree with it. The same thing is true of Trump's conviction on 34 counts of fraud. They're going to argue that this was not a fair trial. That's absurd. Same thing is true of the sexual defamation case. They're going to claim that that was um, a fraudulent trial. That's also absurd. And both cases have been held up against uh, uh, every appeal Trump has brought to them. And they're not going to go away because they aren't federal charges and Trump cannot squash them, which he would do if he could, but he can't. So, what's going on here? We've entered an era in which reality doesn't matter. Well, we've always been there. The only difference is at a certain point in history, only those people who endorsed what would be called, you know, official reality, only those people who actually believed in fact based evidence were speaking. But with the rise of the internet and the democratization of that, we've lost that entirely. And by democratization, I certainly do not mean it's not controlled. It is heavily controlled by people like Fox News, by Rush Limbaugh and Hannity, and the people who come after Rush, all the right wing influences out there, the Charlie Kirks and whatnot. These people are massively constructing their own reality in complete opposition to all the kinds of objective measures that used to be used. Remember, used to be used only from about the 1930s or so on. So you had a brief period in which there was some objectivity because the news was controlled by people who had an interest in being objective. That interest has died. And now the interest is in being partisan. And part of the reason here, and this is one of the things McIntyre gets to as well, is one of the reasons here is that controversy sells better. I mean, it always has, and it certainly does now. Used to be, clicks on clickbait and things like that, but you know, so actual factual reporting simply can't compete with partisan reporting because partisan reporting, as it turns out, happens to be what people want. They want the drama. You know, CNN and Fox News and other news outlets, when Trump's candidacy became real in 2015, uh, their numbers went through the roof. They were selling more ad space and more ad time and making profits like they never had before. So Trump is good for the news. His drama is good for the news. The news no longer is interested in reporting reality, it's interested in reporting the controversy. And of course, to some extent, it always has been. So there's nothing really new here, except for now, the news, which used to be a loss leader for a network to prove that it cared about its community, has now become profit driven, just like everything else. And so, any attempt to be objective, well, if there ever was one, it's certainly gone. My own news sources, I tend to rely on some terrible, terrible, terrible news sources. My friends on Facebook, as he points out, which a lot of people do. Um, and on occasion, very, very, very left-leaning independent media on YouTube. Again, which isn't objective. Now, these news media say they have, quote, the receipts, they have the evidence, but it doesn't take that much critical thinking to see that they are skewing the interpretation of that evidence. They do have the evidence, that is true, but they skew the evidence into the narrative that they want. And that's actually, the big buzzword here is narrative. Everything has become narrative. Science is a narrative. Truth is a narrative. Reality is a narrative. Everything is a narrative. And whoever controls the narrative controls reality and therefore has power. It's a vicious cycle. Those who are in power have better ability to control the narrative. By controlling the narrative, they maintain power. So, you know, in my view, this is how you get fascism 101. But what do I know? All right. So, good book, definitely worth looking at. It's a short read, which would be the main reason why I'd recommend it, because honestly, like I said, it's 7 or 8 years out of date, and some of these concepts need to be updated, and some of the analysis here is a little bit shallow for what needs to be there. But nonetheless, a very good book, a very readable book, and a good entryway into thinking about these issues. If you've never ever had to deal with the idea of postmodernism and post-structuralism and deconstruction and what these things really mean, this is a good introduction to that too, because that material is something of a background to where we are. Mm, I think there are other ways in too, but that is something of a way in. Anyway, excuse me.